Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Monday, January 31st. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 215 days, the game against Michigan in exactly 300 days. This podcast has been around long enough that we are starting to develop some annual traditions around here. We just hit our 500th episode earlier this month, and there are certain popular shows from previous years that we're now starting to kind of cycle back and update after the end of another college football season. One of those is the list of college football Bluebloods. That's something that our friend Brett Ciancia of Pick Six Previews has been doing an annual survey about for 8 seasons now. He was on last offseason to talk about it, and he's back now to share the latest update. Brett, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me back on. Yeah, excited to get into the offseason here. There's never a dull moment. As I like to view it, it's a 365-day sport. So, every January I run a poll. It's a basic yes-no poll about 18 programs out there, whether the fans view them as a blue blood program. And we can get into what, everyone's exact definitions or criteria. Everyone's got their own rules, really. So I look at it as a perception item. It's just the vast majority of the population views them as such, and they kind of hold that moniker.
So before we get into the Bluebloods portion of the conversation, you just received quite an honor. You are something of a college football preseason magazine Blue Blood yourself. We were talking before the show. I mean, that you received some pretty significant recognition for the work that you do with your Pick Six Previews book that you put out every year during the summer before the season. Let people know about that.
Yeah, thank you. It was great news last night. So Stats and Accuracy is the company that grades all these preseason books that you see on newsstands, the Phil Steele, Lindy's, Athlons of the world, Street and Smith. They've been grading these books for 30 years. And so the 2021 results came out, and I was number one in the country. That's all magazines, online publications, everything. So I got the 2021 title, as well as last year's 2020. And that was good enough to give me the 5-year title, the 5-year average. So looking at 17 through 21, everything out there, I was crowned number one. So just a testament to, how I view this, how I work on it every day of the year. It's 365 days, like I said, calling coaches, calling coordinators, running my numbers, watching game tape. I really dig in. It's a one-man company. I guess I would call it new blood because I'm unseating a lot of these old legacy brands that have hundreds of writers. But this is a one-man show over here. So, I'm pretty proud of that accomplishment, and it was great to see the reception yesterday.
And if you want to find those rankings, it's actually on one of my favorite college football websites. It is nothing fancy, but if you go to football.stassen.com, STASSEN.com, that is actually run by an Ohio State guy, someone who was part of the Ozone community from a long time while Tony Gerderman and I were there. You can find that. He has been tracking that, like Brett said, for decades. Really, really interesting stuff. So football.stassen.com if you want to see more about that. Now, on to the Bluebloods. You mentioned, the concept of Bluebloods, and, that's an intriguing one to me because I think a lot of people would look, if you say, what's a college football blue blood? Some of the teams are pretty obvious, Alabama, Ohio State, like those are both, the rich, the rich family in the big old English manor house of college football. But, on others, including multiple recent national champions, there's a lot more disagreement. So what to you exactly does it mean for a program to be a college football blue blood?
Yeah, so it's a multifaceted issue here. I mean, first you got to define, the term blue blood. It comes from old European nobility. It's royal lineage. It's not just who's hot who's hot this year. I saw a lot of the younger replies on Twitter saying, "How isn't Clemson and Georgia up there?" And it's something that it looks like it's been accruing over generations. It's programs that have been dominant across the decades. Especially in that 50s, 60s, 70s range when the sport was really growing nationally. So what I say in the book and what I said in the poll is, I actually end up polling 170,000 people here, 170,000 votes. So if you ask each one of them, you're probably going to get 170,000 different answers of what a blue blood means to them. So, there are so many different categories to look at in stats like national champions, wins, conference titles, Heisman winners, All-Americans, AP, top 5 finishes, everything. So all the numbers are in there. There's also the qualitative stuff, how dominant has the program been, their impact on the sport. One way I like to look at it too is if, you talk to your grandfather about the sport or your dad, it's programs that they can span across 3 different generations. Everyone that has ever loved and touched college football can pretty much point to these 8 programs. And this is the 8th year I've ran the poll. And all 8 years, it's the same top 8 that are clearly defined by the voters. Whatever criteria they all have, like I said, everyone's got their own criteria and definitions of the term. But when the dust settles, it's these 8 programs every year. It's Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Michigan, USC, Nebraska, Texas, and the order might fluctuate a tiny bit, but it's pretty well demarcated there. And there's a vast drop off from number 8 down to the number 9 through 18 range. So fascinating that through the years the perception doesn't seem to change.
Yeah, I mean, the top 4 on that list that you just read down, Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, those are 4 programs that have been national title winners or contenders in virtually every decade since like World War II. So, if you're not including those, you probably don't have much of a list, of anyone else. So, after that, though, that's where things get interesting to me, because number 5 on this year's list is a team that has not won a conference championship since 1999, and that is Nebraska. And, as someone who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, like Nebraska, if you had told me in 1995, okay, when it gets to 1999, they're not going to win a conference championship for the next 23 years. And oh, by the way, you're not going to believe what conference they'd be playing in after that point. But I would have thought you were nuts. I mean, you go to that stadium and the side of the press box in Lincoln, they have, conference champions and national champions. And it looks like they just, looks like the workers just went on strike because it's year after year after year, and it just stops after 1999. And it's like, where's the rest? Mm-hmm. So what is it about the Huskers that they still hold that kind of respect around the nation, even with a 22-year title drought right now?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at Nebraska. I think a couple of things. Their dominance from the 70s, 80s, 90s was so severe, so stark a difference there. I think Tom Osborne coached 25 seasons. None with 3 losses or more. It was all strictly 9+ wins. Back then it was an only 11-game regular season, mind you. So, high caliber wins every year. He finally got those titles at the end where it exploded with a 60-3 record over 5 years, 3 national titles in 4 years. So really just one of the more dominant dynasties we've seen in that generation. But it wasn't just that. It was decades before that with Bob Devaney winning the back-to-back crown 70-71. So that just has left such an imprint on the sport. But yeah, you question what has happened there. I think all of the advantages that they had in the 80s and 90s have since been neutralized. You look at what made them great was their walk-on program. They would have, hundreds of Nebraska walk-ons come in. They were the only show on TV. So nationally, you got all that recruiting and exposure. And then even the strength and conditioning program, they were the first in college football to institute a weightlifting program. As crazy as that sounds, Boyd Epley started that, really put them on the map with their Husker power, they called it. So, and now think of the modern game. Every single game's televised, so that TV advantage is neutralized. Everyone's lifting weights. That strength and conditioning advantage is gone. And their vast walk-on program with Prop 48 and scholarship limits, and just the idea that some of those Nebraska kids could go get more exposure, or not more, but some exposure at North Dakota State or Kansas State. And so all their advantages have been neutralized, and they're in a tough population spot for recruiting. So why does that relate to Bluebloods? I think that people just have this great perception about them, how dominant they were for those 30 years. And it's not that they fell off a cliff in 99. They, Bo Pelini, he won 9 wins every year. The only other programs in his time to do that were, I think, Alabama and Oregon. So, I mean, they were okay. They were above average for a while. It really fell off a cliff with Mike Riley. It's been pretty poor since then. And so that gets back to the question of what are we talking about here? Blue blood. I mean, you're talking about 50, 60, 70 years history. Maybe a look over the last 5 years in that category.
So number 6 on that list is a team that shared the 1997 national title with Nebraska. And it was another team that seemed like it might be sliding down the list this time last year, but rebounded with a pretty big 2021. Plug your ears, Ohio State fans. That is Michigan. Did the numbers change much from last year after they finally beat Ohio State, finally won the Big Ten, finally made the college football playoff? Or have they been kind of consistently in that sort of safely in that blue blood territory all along?
Yeah, so they got definitely a boost this year, and some of that might be some recency bias because it just happened. But I think to some of the younger generation that hasn't seen them been, winning a national title since '97 or winning a conference outright since '03, just to see them finally break over that hump, beat Ohio State, get into the national playoff, the semifinals, the top 5, win the Big Ten. So yeah, those were big check marks there to kind of reestablish that, hey, this can be a successful program. This can be a nationally elite program. Even if it ends up being just the 1 year, it kind of revived them or brought them back to life. So you saw a 12% boost for them. They were down at 64% last year, up to 76 this year. So, and I know the Buckeye fans, because I see you guys all on Twitter, and I love the engagement and the passion. The thing that gets brought up is, well, hey, Michigan's the winningest program of all time, the most wins. And Ohio State right away will come back and say, well, yeah, take out that stuff before 1900, and then we'll talk. But even when you do that, I mean, if you look at just the last 100 years, Michigan's still top 5 in wins. If you look at post-World War II, they're still top 5 in wins. So I think they've cemented their case there as a blue blood.
And, just as Nebraska and Michigan are sort of linked through the 1997 thing, two programs that are going to be linked through one of the greatest football games, I think, of the last quarter century at least. USC and Texas, they played a Rose Bowl that you may remember. Keith Jackson on the call. It was a pretty good game. They were the last two teams that crossed that threshold of 50% and were deemed blue bloods. USC at 69%, Texas at just 52%. It looks like both of them have kind of been slowly sliding down this list for a number of seasons. Is Texas in danger of sliding completely to the wrong side of the line next year?
So, yeah, I'm interested with Texas because these two programs you mentioned, USC and Texas, they're the only two that have fallen in the percentages the last 4 straight polls I've ran. So the last 4, they've gone down each year. Texas really took a hit this year, dropping from 60% down to 52%, barely above the line there. Now, I will say this with a caveat. So, again, this is a Twitter poll. This is nothing definitive. This is hard to monitor. It's not an exact science. So what I want to reference here is, out of the 18 teams, the 18 polls, some of them are voted on more. They're shared more. They're retweeted more. And Texas was one of those that, in basic rivalry Twitter fashion, the Oklahoma fans shared like crazy. And you can imagine what way they were voting against their arch rival Texas. So I don't want to say that's the reason for the drop. Of course, you look at a sustained losing drought there. They haven't won a national title since 2005. They haven't really been competitive in the Big 12 for a while. A couple coaching changes, and they seem to be stuck in the mud. So I can see why they'd slowly decline, but I think part of that sharp decline was maybe some retweeting business. But yeah, so and then with USC, theirs has been more of a steady decline. No Twitter gamesmanship there. That's been kind of the consistent voter count. With USC, I think that when people turn them on, it's not the USC, turn them on TV. They're not seeing the USC that they grew up with or their dads or grandfathers told them about. They turn it on. The Coliseum's empty. Their defense doesn't want to be there. They don't want to hit. They're giving up 40 a game, and they're no longer tailback U. The old tailback U history where they would run the ball and win Heisman's for their running back. They're an air raid now. So I think that they're starting to lose their identity. There's not as much passion out there on the West Coast that there is anymore, or that there used to be. So I think all that factors in. Again, there's hard stats and some opinion and some quantitative, qualitative. It's all factors in. Both those two are trending down.
Yeah, and one that I was assuming is trending up that I was kind of surprised to see still on the south side of that line at 42% was Georgia. And that, they've been to the national championship game multiple times in the last 5 seasons, just won a national title. We talked about the recency bias of, help Michigan's bump. Georgia looked pretty darn good this year. And, I am old enough to remember the Ray Goff era and, the down Georgia teams, but they have been pretty respectable for pretty much all of this century. Mark Richt had some really good teams. I know this was just their first national title since 1980, but that was still kind of surprising to see them at 42%. How much more support did they get this year as compared to a year ago?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, for the national champion, they were the most. They got the biggest increase year over year. They were down at 25% last year, got a plus 17 all the way up to 42%, making them the highest among the non-blue bloods here in the poll. So yeah, a huge recency bias boost there, but I don't want to call it all that. I think that it's an important demarcation to get that national title, to get that check mark on the resume for the generation after 1980. They're now seeing Georgia on the championship stage with the confetti, and that was really the last piece they needed because they'd been close for years. The whole Mark Richt era, they were 10 wins, and on the in SEC title games, close to winning national titles, 2012, 2017. So they were close. It was just, this was the final check mark. So I can understand it. I think the reason why they're not cemented into that top 8 is when you look back at the other intervals, the last 100 years, post World War II, they're in that 10th, 11th, 12th range in wins. You want to be up in that top 8. And then, when you talk about 1980, that was special, Herschel Walker. But before that, you got to go back another 38 years, all the way back to 1942 with Frank Sinkwich. So for a national title and a Heisman. So I think that they don't have the championship firepower that some of those above them have. Now, hey, if they start forming a little mini dynasty here, they could continue to rise.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into my next question and last question here, which is two other national title winners from the past, 5 years who missed out. LSU at 37%, Clemson at 27%. And again, I'm old enough to remember the Tommy West and Tommy Bowden eras at Clemson and Jerry DiNardo at LSU. So, it is not like those teams have been Oklahoma consistent or Ohio State consistent or, even Alabama consistent outside of a few exceptions. But, the last three LSU coaches have all won national championships. Clemson has been about as consistent as any program in the nation over the past decade or so. How long does a school like that need to stay in the top 5, top 10 to really start moving the needle towards the other side of that line?
That's a great question. It's something we haven't seen yet. In the time I've been running this poll, we haven't seen somebody move up the ladder into the blue blood category. And it becomes a matter of, is it even possible? I mean, are we just talking about something that was settled 50 years ago and that's set in stone? I mean, if that's the real term of blue blood, maybe that's already been determined. But Clemson, they're in that 28%, 30% area, not very close to breaking through in this poll. But I think you look back at their longer term history, they were a solid program, Clemson. I mean, and LSU for that matter, in the top 10, top 15 usually. Not a consistent powerhouse like the other ones. Alabama really is the powerhouse in the South. And you could even make the case that Tennessee has more historical relevance and more national titles and a case for it than LSU or Clemson down there in that region. So, that'll be tough to move up the ladder. We'll see. I mean, for what it's worth, when you look at the blue blood list, it's a lot of Midwest teams. It's Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, Nebraska, really only one out of the South, Alabama. And just the way that the population trends have shifted and the importance of football to different regions has shifted, the South really is booming. And that's been well documented. Look at the BCS era and the playoff era. It's SEC dominated and Southern dominated with Clemson and Miami. So, Clemson more recently. But so we'll see if another 10, 20 years go by and it's more of this Southern dominance, maybe more of these are going to be considered into that category. Florida State, LSU. I think to answer your question, long-winded answer here, I know, but can somebody climb in? Can a new blood climb in the blue blood category? And if Florida State can't do it, I don't know if anybody can, because that's a program that, they don't have the pre-World War II history, all the legacy wins. They're a newer program, a newer school. But once Bobby Bowden took over in the 70s, they've been more dominant than anybody. An NCAA record, 14 straight top 5 finishes. Think of that. That's over a decade straight in the top 5. 3 national titles, Heisman winners. So they have a ton of firepower, albeit the last 30, 40 years. And that wasn't enough to do it. So I'm not sure if we'll even ever see a change here.
Well, I do appreciate you coming back on to talk about this. As I said, last year, I saw this and I thought this is a really interesting conversation. And then with some of the changes this year and so some of the adjustments that have happened, I thought, well, this is definitely worth revisiting again. And I have a sneaking suspicion sometime in January 2023, we'll probably be talking about this again. Whatever has happened between now and then, I'll be interested to hear how this got updated. Brett, before I let you go, let people know where they can find you on Twitter and where they can buy your book a little later. You're still working, got a lot of work to do between now and release date, but where they can find your book later in the year. Yeah,
well, thanks for having me on anytime. I appreciate it. And to the listeners, no worries for Ohio State. They stayed exactly at 93%, a healthy margin there, only behind Alabama. So number 2 again. You look at across the generations, across the decades, Ohio State has never really had a down period. I mean, maybe a couple years under Cooper, but really that's just there's not much there to pick at. So they've been a consistent winner, a national brand, national champion. So certainly a blue blood. So so you can follow me at Pick 6 Previews on Twitter, pick6previews.com. And again, the annual season preview book, we're still about 7 months away here, 6 months away. I'm hunkering down, monitoring the transfer portal, but I'll be calling coaches, calling coordinators, running my numbers and over the next 6 months. So we'll talk again before then, but thanks again for having me. Well, thanks again to Brett for joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I find this whole Blue Bloods conversation super, super interesting. It's kind of a combination of college football history, a little bit of the state of the sport right now, a little bit of a philosophical conversation as well. So I find that super interesting. As I said, we will definitely have Brett on in January of 2023 to have this conversation again and see whether the numbers have moved at all one direction or another.
So make sure you stick around for that. We'll be back in 365 days or so with that conversation. But also make sure you check out Brett on Twitter. As he said, his handle is at Pick6Previews, and the 6 is written out SIX, so PICKSIX Previews. And also his website is Pick6Previews, again, written out PICKSIX Previews.com. He has some good information on there. And that book is one that I read. It is an electronic download. I read it cover to cover. Fantastic information, great stuff. And as you heard, pretty darn accurate. That Brett knows what he's talking about. That's why he keeps showing up on this show. So that'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.